The story began with the protagonist who had been betrayed by his friends. They sealed him away with countless monsters, intending for him to die. On the brink of death, the protagonist cast a reincarnation spell and awakened 20 years later in a high school. He found himself in the body of an academy boy who possessed the void attribute, considered the strongest. Determined, he vowed to take revenge on his former friends. The story unfolded from that day. Suddenly, dungeon gates appeared and monsters started pouring out. Only those who had awakened magical abilities could stop them. Among them were two fighters battling the monsters, Claudia Burjo and Ingolf von Dietz. Others included Nathaniel Cavell and Iwako Heidke. A girl named Lei Ruoxi was also among the awakened, all fighting valiantly against the monsters. Amidst the chaos, a civilian screamed for help as a monster approached. Ingolf urged Claudia to hurry and help the victims. With an indifferent expression, Claudia commented that they were simply too far away. At that critical moment, a giant monster threatened a trembling civilian, but someone intervened, delivering a powerful kick to the monster and sending it flying. After an explosive impact and falling debris, a man stood in front of the citizens and asked if everyone was all right. He promised to take care of the threat, and it was revealed that this man was the protagonist, Misato Kawakairo. He charged at the monster with a glowing hand, yellow light shining in his eyes. In a flash, he moved through the horde, killing every monster with precision and striking a heroic pose. Observing him, the other awakened individuals were in awe, remarking on how incredible he was to face so many alone. Ryuoxi noted that with his time magic attribute, he could see the future and anticipate every move the monsters made. To her, he no longer seemed human. While the others whispered among themselves, the protagonist continued eliminating monsters. After defeating nearly all the creatures, only one remained. He delivered the final blow, declaring it the last one. With determination, he stated that he would protect the peace and began sealing the gate from which the monsters emerged. But just then, he was attacked from behind. His expression turned to shock as he put distance between himself and the attacker. Suddenly, he was pulled into the portal due to the ambush. From the other side, he saw the party members watching him and noticed a seal forming on the portal. Confused, he questioned what was happening, admitting he had never foreseen such a future. He wondered if everyone was part of the betrayal. From within the portal, he asked them why they would do this. Nathaniel grinned and replied that the very reason he was unaware was why he had been betrayed. The rest of the party members smiled evilly. Ryuoxi told him that he was a level 100 monster who could use time attribute magic. Claudia added that they just wanted to earn money safely. Ingolf sneered, accusing the protagonist of putting them in danger simply because he wanted to help people. Iwako echoed this sentiment, blaming him for leading them into such peril. Nathaniel declared that it would be the last time they ever saw him. As they turned away, the protagonist banged on the portal, shouting in disbelief and demanding to be released. He reflected on their betrayal and recalled his memories as the leader of the Golden Seekers. He had tried to protect the world and everyone in it. Anger and disbelief overtook him as he shouted, wondering why they had betrayed him. At that moment, a swarm of monsters lunged at him. Though he swiftly dealt with one, he was horrified to see an entire army of monsters waiting to kill him. He activated his future vision and attempted to foresee a way out. He thought he could escape, but the only future he saw was his death at the hands of the monsters. Smiling grimly, he realized that the future he once had no longer existed. Surrounded, he charged with a glowing yellow fist, his body enveloped in a powerful aura. After a fierce battle, he knelt in a pool of his own blood. He admitted that he couldn't change the future. Looking up at the monsters, he accepted that he might have no choice but to face death. The monsters began to swarm him, but just then he was hurled into the air. Refusing to die like that, yellow energy swelled within him. He vowed to reincarnate, reach the peak of his strength, and take revenge on those who betrayed him. The same energy glowed in his eyes. Overwhelmed by rage and despair, he swore to avenge his regrets. Yellow energy swirled around him, and a beam of light shot from his hand as pain from the monsters' attacks consumed him. Suddenly, a glimmer of yellow light appeared, and the next moment, someone woke up. The attire suggested the person was in a hospital. Dressed in hospital clothes, he walked toward a mirror and, upon seeing his reflection, confirmed that the reincarnation had worked. It was the protagonist. He looked around and realized he was in a hospital, unfamiliar machines surrounding him. He wondered how many years had passed. If 100 years had gone by, his chance for revenge might have vanished. He imagined the faces of those who betrayed him. At that moment, he noticed something on the table, a student ID. Upon inspecting it, he realized that 20 years had passed since his betrayal, but one detail on the ID shocked him. The body's attribute was void at level 1. Recognizing the attribute, he laughed maniacally. He remembered being feared for his time attribute in his previous life. But as he grew stronger, he realized he had reached a limit. Even his clairvoyance couldn't reveal the full extent of the void attribute's power. He pitied the original owner of the body. The void attribute was undoubtedly the strongest, yet it was so rare that no one in his previous life knew how to train it. That was why the body's original owner remained at level 1. He wondered if the boy had been mocked for having no attribute, perhaps many times. He assured the boy that he would make his name known throughout the world as one of the strongest adventurers. Thanks to his clairvoyance, the protagonist knew how to train the void attribute. With this power, he vowed to become the absolute strongest and make those traitors pay. Protagonist continued contemplating, expressing that in order to get revenge on the traitors, he needed to level up first. He then lay down on the hospital bed with his eyes closed. He thought about the void attribute, recognizing that, as the name suggested, it was related to magic. To control nihility, he imagined a void where shining blue square structures existed. He continued thinking that the essence of this attribute lay in the ability to freely project one's imagination into reality. He reflected that while everyone could imagine things, turning those thoughts into reality was the true challenge. He visualized someone thinking of a sculpture, yet finding it very difficult to draw. He considered that it was fortunate this body was badly injured, for if he could apply the image in his mind to the body, he might heal. He began visualizing every single cell being restored by magic. At that very moment, all the wounds on his body began to disappear and heal. Clenching his hand, he noted with satisfaction that it had worked. Rubbing the area where the wound had been, he thought that since it was only rudimentary casting, the recovery speed wasn't impressive. His insides weren't fully healed, but by using the magic multiple times, he could increase its level. He understood that the ability to convert imagination into reality would improve with practice, expanding the range of images he could bring to life. This progression, he thought, would allow the creation and usage of many different kinds of magic. Eventually, the image in his mind could be realized exactly as he envisioned it in reality. A glint of a smile appeared on his face. At that moment, a doctor entered his hospital room, saying he was finally awake. The doctor rushed toward him, advising him not to move just yet since he had sustained serious injuries from a monster attack. The protagonist reflected on what had happened and realized the original owner of this body had been attacked. The doctor, smiling, commented that despite such dire circumstances, the protagonist had woken up. He added that it was almost as if the saintess had bestowed a miracle upon him. The protagonist questioned what he meant by saintess. The doctor, surprised, asked if he didn't know. The protagonist shook his head and replied that he didn't. The doctor began explaining about the saintess of the pentagram saints. However, the protagonist remained clueless and admitted he didn't know who the pentagram saints were either. Thinking aloud, the doctor concluded that since the protagonist had only just regained consciousness, it was natural he was confused. He stated that a thorough examination was in order and left to prepare everything needed, telling the protagonist to wait there. Once the doctor had left, the protagonist thought about the saintess and the pentagram saints. He reflected that they must be one of the clans or adventurers who had emerged in the 20 years during his absence. He got out of bed and approached a TV remote, acknowledging that while leveling up was important, he also needed to understand the current state of the world. He turned on the TV, which began broadcasting a special segment about the SSS-class dungeon disaster from 20 years ago. Upon seeing this, he thought it was perfect, a special on the incident where he was betrayed. The news report continued, revealing that the SSS-class dungeon disaster had been caused by the culprit, whose name the protagonist waited to hear. The report named the culprit as the leader of the Golden Seeker, a level 10-time attribute user, Masato Koikiro, who was none other than the protagonist himself. He stood up in shock. Watching the TV, he thought in disbelief that he was the culprit. He wondered what that could possibly mean. The news explained further that Masato Koikiro had predicted the future disaster but had not informed anyone. Instead, he planned to use the chaos to rule the world. The other members of the Golden Seeker prevented this and were now hailed as the great heroes known as the Pentagram Saints. After a fierce battle, Masato was defeated and the dungeon sealed successfully, a feat known by all. Even now, the Pentagram Saints were said to lead the world in various areas. As the broadcast prepared to invite experts, the protagonist turned the TV off. Laughing while covering his face, he expressed that not only had they betrayed him, they had dragged his dignity through the mud. They had sacrificed him and shamelessly reaped the rewards, now celebrated as so-called heroes. Clenching the remote tightly, he declared he would never forgive them. With a menacing expression, he vowed to send all of them to hell. A few moments later, after calming down, he thought about the need to remain undetected by their radar. At that moment, he recalled that the original owner of the body attended an academy. Picking up a phone and looking at the screen, he confirmed his suspicion. The body's original owner was connected to the headmaster of the Takigo Adventure Training Academy. The academy was led by none other than Iwako Hideki, one of those who had betrayed him. Clenching the phone, he thought it was incredibly fortunate to immediately know the location of one of them. Sitting down on the hospital bed, he acknowledged that Iwako was a cautious man who wouldn't show weakness easily. He noticed a student ID card and reflected on the vast difference in level between himself and Iwako. Defeating him now would be impossible. Lying down and gazing at the ceiling while stretching out his hand, he realized he couldn't do anything at level 1. For now, he resolved to level up and search for Iwako. With determination in his eyes, he clenched his fist and declared that Iwako would be his first target. A few weeks later, the scene shifted. The protagonist, now fully healed, looked at himself in the mirror, thinking that he could finally move without issues. The doctor entered the room, expressing disbelief that he had made a full recovery in just a week. As the protagonist changed into the academy uniform, the doctor continued to wonder aloud if this could be a blessing from the saints. Perfecting his tie, the protagonist responded that it was. He believed everything was thanks to his own power. Leaving the hospital room, he thanked the doctor for taking care of him. The doctor advised him to take care from now on, Outside the hospital, the protagonist stated that he had completed the barebone preparations. He considered his current level sufficient and proposed to himself that it was time to warm up by heading to a dungeon. The protagonist explained that he had heard from the doctor that the entire family of the original owner of the body had died in an accident. While walking on the street, he expressed feeling sorry for the original owner of the body. However, as he closed his eyes, he thought that it was a good thing for him, as it meant he could do what he wanted. He then approached the dungeon portal, looking at his phone where a map was open. He wondered if this was the place, and putting on a mask, thought about leveling up and growing stronger. He wanted to try things out there. Fully equipped with a mask and hoodie, he approached the reception where a guard looked at him. He showed his ID to the guard. At that moment, the guard held the protagonist's hand and called out to him. The protagonist asked what it was, and the guard informed him that he was only level 27. The guard explained that adventurers needed to be at least level 30 to form parties and enter the dungeon. Shouting, the guard questioned if he planned to enter alone, calling it practically suicide. The protagonist calmly responded that the guard's concerns might be valid in normal cases. He then swapped his hand from the guard's grasp and, with a menacing expression, declared that he was a student of the Takigo Adventure Training Academy. He stated that as long as he signed the consent form, it should be fine, asking if he was right. He reminisced that he had looked into this rule while he was in the hospital. The guard acknowledged that he was right, but before he could say more, someone called out to the protagonist, telling him that it was enough already. 3 boys were seen standing near a tree. One of them, a golden-haired boy, said that the guard was just saying that because he was worried about him. The golden-haired boy clarified that the guard's warning was out of concern. Another boy in the middle accused the protagonist of being a greenhorn and told him to know his place. Ignoring them, the protagonist asked the guard if he just needed to sign there, pointing toward the digital tablet on the reception. He signed the consent form, but the guard wanted him to wait. However, the protagonist walked away, saying there shouldn't be any other issue now and asking if that was right. The guard simply watched as the protagonist headed toward the dungeon portal. The protagonist thanked him, expressing gratitude for his concern. The guard then turned to the 3 boys under the tree, asking them to follow the protagonist. He stated that letting him go alone was suicide. One of the boys sneered upon hearing this and questioned why they should follow him. The purple-haired boy remarked that it might actually be a good thing. He added that if no one was watching, then even if something happened, it wouldn't be a problem. His expression turned serious and evil as he asked if he was wrong. The 3 boys then started approaching the dungeon portal, acting tough. One of them scoffed that the protagonist needed another 100 years before he could do anything. The guard waved at them, apologized for the bother, and said he was counting on them. Inside the dungeon, the 3 boys walked together. The purple-haired boy suggested they do what they usually do. The golden-haired boy agreed, mentioning killing the kid and blaming it on the monsters. One of the boys commented that it was thanks to such idiots that their pockets got fuller. 10 minutes later, they were still running through the dungeon. The purple-haired boy noted that it had been a straight road so far. The golden-haired boy said they hadn't caught up to the kid yet. Just then, the golden-haired boy pointed out something, saying they had finally caught up. They saw the protagonist standing in front of a horde of monsters, releasing a menacing aura. With a single slash of fire, he killed a monster. He then used another attack, a green wind swirling around his hand, which he shot at the monsters. The green wind pushed the fire attack forward, and as a result, all the monsters were reduced to ashes in an instant. The group of boys watched in shock. The purple-haired boy exclaimed in disbelief. Another boy remarked that the protagonist had completely annihilated D-rank monsters by himself. The golden-haired boy pointed out a rare item drop, a bag of crystals. All the boys' faces turned greedy as they thought about selling it and living comfortably for the next 6 months. Believing the protagonist hadn't noticed them, they observed him picking up the loot dropped by the monsters. They mocked him as an idiot and planned to kill him to take the rare item. All 3 boys dashed toward the protagonist, signaling each other. The purple-haired boy commanded them to kill him. One boy unleashed a blue-colored attack, and the golden-haired boy launched a green attack at the protagonist. The protagonist pulled down his mask and, with a menacing expression, scolded them for thinking they were being slick. He dodged all the attacks and remarked that no matter the era, there were always people trying to take what belonged to someone else. The golden-haired boy and the boy in the red jacket were shocked, questioning if the protagonist had eyes on his back. As the purple-haired boy charged with a fire attack, shouting for the protagonist to die, the protagonist simply turned slightly, clenched his fist, and punched him in the gut. The punch was so powerful that blood spurted from the purple-haired boy's mouth, and he was thrown far away. Turning away, the protagonist declared that he would crush vermin like them without mercy. He said he would use them as stepping stones without hesitation for the sake of his revenge, which had now begun. A blue aura began glowing around him. The scene shifted to outside the dungeon portal. Inside the dungeon, someone stepped forward and began walking. A boy folded his arms, and it was shown that he had arrived after hearing that a student from the academy had entered a dungeon alone. This boy was introduced as Yoichi Tsudai, one of Iwako's subordinates. Yoichi continued looking at the 3 unconscious boys lying on the ground. He questioned why novice hunter adventurers were lying dead and wondered aloud about what could have happened there. The scene transitioned to night, showing a building where the protagonist was seated. He stated that in the D-rank dungeon, he had managed to level up and test out void magic. Looking at a student ID, the protagonist revealed that his new spell was Info Obscurity. He smiled and noted that the spell not only allowed him to fake his levels but also erase dungeon entry records. He acknowledged the usefulness of this skill, mentioning how he had used it to manipulate the security guard. The protagonist lay on his bed, looking at his phone and remarking that tomorrow would be his first day at the academy. While scrolling, he noticed some hateful messages directed at him. Someone had demanded cash, saying cough up the cash already, while another message told him to get your head out. Upon seeing these messages, the protagonist understood the situation, thinking, so that's how it is. The next day, the scene shifted to the academy. The protagonist was walking when a cute girl greeted him with a cheerful good morning, asking if he was feeling better now. She was introduced as Asahi Karin. The protagonist thanked her and said he was fine now. Asahi responded that she was glad because she had been really worried. Observing her, the protagonist reflected that the original owner of the body must have had people who cared for him. Just then, someone else called out to the protagonist, mocking him as the no-attribute who had barely escaped death. 3 boys approached, and the leader claimed that since he was protecting a weak level 1 like the protagonist, he deserved something in return. He grinned evilly and demanded money, saying he was short on cash and assumed the protagonist had brought it. The protagonist remembered the messages from the previous night and realized these were the culprits. At that moment, Asahi intervened, telling them to stop because the protagonist had just been discharged from the hospital. However, the protagonist noticed her trembling hand as she stood up to the bullies. Stepping forward and shielding Asahi, he thanked her but said he would be fine. The boys laughed, one commenting that the words were bold for someone with no attribute. Another warned him not to act tough just because he was in front of a girl. The leader of the group reminded the protagonist that he was a useless nobody who couldn't even use magic. He cracked his hands ready to fight, but the protagonist responded that it was the bullies who needed a reminder of their place. Unlike them, he claimed, he was someone who kept his word. He recalled the promise he had made to the original owner's body to make his name known throughout the world. The protagonist signaled the bullies to come at him, which angered the leader. The leader asked what nonsense the protagonist was spouting and began charging a fire spell. Swirling flames gathered around his hand. Asahi warned that using magic outside the dungeon was against school rules, but the leader shouted at her to shut up, blaming the talentless piece of shit for trying to defy him. He then launched the fire attack at the protagonist. The protagonist stood still and watched the incoming attack. At that moment, he used his void attribute magic to replicate the leader's fire magic and unleashed an even bigger fire attack. The 2 fire spells collided, with the protagonist's attack clearly overpowering the other. An explosion followed as the spells clashed. The 2 remaining bullies were shocked. One exclaimed that the protagonist had used the same magic, while the other questioned how long he had been capable of it. The protagonist then taunted the leader, asking if that was all he had. The leader twitched and ordered the other 2 bullies to attack. They obeyed, launching a water attack and a wind attack while asking how the protagonist liked that. But the protagonist countered by replicating both spells, water in one hand and wind in the other, and hurled them back at the bullies, successfully neutralizing the attacks. The leader was stunned and questioned what was happening. One of the bullies wondered aloud how many attributes the protagonist could use, while another said he had never heard of such a thing. The protagonist's voice echoed as he asked if they were satisfied. He declared it was his turn now and, walking toward the bullies, assured them he wouldn't kill them at least. Flames surged from his hands, terrifying the bullies, who turned and fled. The protagonist then addressed the leader, asking whether the original owner of the body hadn't asked them for help before. Without waiting for an answer, he said he didn't need to hear it. Staring menacingly at the leader, the protagonist grabbed his mouth and began tightening his grip. He remarked that vermin like the leader always spouted the same things, so no matter what he said, it wouldn't stop his fist. As tears welled up in the bully's eyes, the protagonist, his fist brimming with flames, delivered a powerful punch to the leader's face. The force sent the bully flying, his face wrecked and smoke rising from his body. Asahi called out the protagonist's name. He quietly resolved to himself that no one would ever look down on him again. From now on, he said, they would walk the path to becoming the strongest adventurer together. The scene shifted as the bullies were seen apologizing to the protagonist. 2 underlings of the bully leader were carrying him, apologizing. The leader of the bullies cursed under his breath, admitting that the protagonist had completely changed after being discharged from the hospital. At that moment, the protagonist commented that in the end, the leader wasn't all that strong. Behind him stood Asahi. The protagonist and Asahi were seen walking through the academy's lobby. Many students were watching the protagonist, causing him to wonder if he had stood out too much. As the protagonist was about to enter the classroom amidst the crowd, someone called out to him, asking him to wait a moment. Turning back, it was revealed to be the same boy from the dungeon, who then asked if the protagonist had some time. The protagonist, thinking the boy looked like an upperclassman and feeling it was a hassle, considered brushing him off. He apologized, saying class was about to start and he needed to leave. The boy then mentioned he hadn't yet introduced himself. He revealed his name to be Yoichi Tsudai, leader of Biting the Cat. Asahi echoed the name, surprised. Upon hearing this, the protagonist stopped in his tracks, recognizing the clan name as the one created by Principal Iwako. The boy continued, asking once again if the protagonist could spare some time. The protagonist, looking back, said that if that was the case, it couldn't be helped. After a moment, Yoichi got straight to the point, asking whether the protagonist was the one who had defeated the adventurers found in the D-rank dungeon the previous night. The protagonist questioned what he was talking about, internally wondering how Yoichi had discovered something that was supposed to be kept secret. Yoichi explained that he had been told a student entered the dungeon, so he investigated. Inside, he found infamous criminals known as hunting novices. Additionally, he noted that the protagonist had used multi-attribute magic that morning. With a menacing glare, Yoichi waited for an answer. The protagonist smiled, thinking that Yoichi didn't know the specifics of his magic. Snapping his fingers, Yoichi demanded the truth, asking once again if the protagonist had defeated them. The protagonist rummaged through his school bag and claimed he didn't remember what happened since he had been attacked suddenly that morning. Taking out his student ID, he stated he was really just a level 1 and therefore couldn't have done something like that. He then showed the ID to Yoichi. Upon inspecting it, Yoichi noted that the ID confirmed the protagonist was level 1 and had the void attribute. Feeling deceived, he thought nobody dared to waste his time. Angry, Yoichi turned away, apologizing for calling the protagonist over. He warned him not to act suspiciously in the future as it caused extra work. Yoichi left the classroom. Watching him go, the protagonist thought about how Yoichi might be useful. With a grin, he considered the possibility of using Yoichi to approach Iwako without raising suspicion. He wondered if there was a way to make Yoichi his pawn. Then the idea struck him. This could be the perfect time to test out a certain magic. An evil smile formed on his face. The scene shifted to Yoichi reporting to Principal Iwako, concluding his report about the events in the D-rank dungeon the previous night. Principal Iwako remarked that it wasn't like Yoichi to screw up. A glimpse of the principal revealed a slightly middle-aged man with many brightly shining rings on his hands. The principal reminded Yoichi to be careful when choosing who to use. Yoichi bowed and apologized sincerely, promising to calm the situation right away. Principal Iwako rose from his seat, asserting that it was only natural. Walking toward Yoichi, he warned that if it became known Yoichi was involved with hunting novices, he too would be criticized. Grabbing Yoichi's face and lifting it with a menacing glare, the principal warned him not to forget that even he could be discarded in a heartbeat if something went wrong. Terrified, Yoichi bowed deeply and expressed his understanding. But as he bowed, anger bubbled within him. Gritting his teeth, he cursed his situation, thinking that if he had known it would come to this, he would have extorted more money from those idiotic hunters. The principal then said there was one thing he still didn't understand. Raising his head, Yoichi asked what it was. Holding a tablet, Principal Iwako explained that according to the report, the student in question was at least a third year. However, no third-year student had entered a dungeon the previous night. Placing the tablet back, he concluded that the adventurers must have been defeated by a monster while hunting novices, and that Yoichi was lying to cover it up. Looking out the window, Iwako said it was more realistic to think that way than to believe one of his own students had defeated novice hunters alone. Yoichi responded with a questioning tone, and Iwako affirmed it, stating that unless something extremely unusual had happened, that was the most plausible conclusion. Just then, Yoichi recalled the protagonist, noting to himself that he was a bit unusual. Addressing the principal, Yoichi suggested whether it was possible that a unique attribute had been involved. The principal, slightly turning his head toward Yoichi, acknowledged that it was certainly a possibility. At that moment, Yoichi grinned, placing a hand on his chest, and requested that Principal Iwako leave the matter to him. He vowed to resolve the issue swiftly, his face displaying a menacing expression. The scene transitioned to the dungeon where the flicker of a fire torch lit up the surroundings. Many students from Iwako Academy were seen using their magic to fire at something. Their target was a monster, and their spells were aimed to bring it down. A monkey-like monster clung to the wall. One of the students exclaimed that it had come this way, prompting many of them to flee in fear as the creature roared. Just then, someone began gathering magic power in his hand. A golden swirl of magical light was directed at the monkey-like monster, killing it instantly. The lifeless body of the monster hit the ground, and the other students stared in awe. The one responsible was none other than Yoichi. Yoichi instructed the students not to break formation. From within the crowd, a student remarked that Yoichi was amazing, noting that he had been chosen by Principal Iwako. Another green-haired student mused about possibly joining the Biting the Cat clan as well. Having defeated multiple monsters, Yoichi declared that he had cleared the area. Senior students saluted him, acknowledging his efforts. He then told them that he would leave the rest to them, to which they all responded in unison with an understood. Internally, Yoichi thought to himself that it was time to do what he came for. He reached beneath his school uniform and retrieved an artifact. He addressed the artifact, commanding it to reveal the protagonist's location. In response, the chains within the artifact came to life, swirling with a blue aura. They shot off rapidly, pulling Yoichi in the direction of the protagonist. Yoichi noted that, as he suspected, the protagonist was far from the other students. He reflected that whatever the protagonist was planning, it was better for him this way. With a menacing laugh, he concluded that it would appear the protagonist's death was just an unfortunate accident, as he would simply claim to have found Asaki dead along the way, something not uncommon in dungeons. He began plotting to kill the protagonist, his expression twisted with malice. He recalled the novice hunter incident and how trouble had seemed to follow ever since the protagonist was discharged from the hospital. Yoichi was also deeply curious about the conversation he had overheard earlier. The narrative shifted to moments earlier. Yoichi was seated at a table while the bullies knelt before him. He questioned them, asking if what they said was true. In a panic, the bullies insisted it was. They pleaded with him to believe them, saying that the no-attribute boy had attacked them using the exact same magic they had used. The golden-haired bully added that the boy had created an enormous flame unlike anything he had seen before. Yoichi expressed disbelief, stating he couldn't accept such claims. Having asked what he needed, he gave an order to his lackeys in a threatening tone, telling them to educate the bullies. He declared he had no use for weaklings who lost to incompetence. As his lackeys seized the bullies, the leader protested, saying that wasn't what Yoichi had promised. Ignoring the protests, Yoichi walked away. One of the bullies tried again, calling out that what was happening wasn't what had been promised. Suddenly, another bully pointed behind Yoichi, prompting the green-haired one to comment with a horrified expression that the protagonist had already ceased to be human. Back in the present, Yoichi continued following the chains, which were guiding him toward the protagonist's location. He thought about the green-haired bully's expression and concluded that the fear he had shown was unnatural. Just to be certain, Yoichi had sent the protagonist to a special class hosted by the Biting the Cat clan, but all he had shown there were powerful illusions. Yoichi suspected the protagonist must have used a magic item or some trick to defeat the novice hunters. He chuckled to himself. As he walked through the dungeon, he noticed the corpse of a monster and wondered if it had been the protagonist's doing. It seemed to have been killed with a single fire attack. He sneered, realizing that the rumors weren't entirely false but scoffing at the power, claiming even Owako, the pentagram dropout, could do that. He acknowledged that for now he had no choice but to obey, but vowed to one day surpass Owako and rule the world as a pentagram. He imagined himself as a king and laughed evilly. He knew, however, that to achieve that, no one could find out about his connection to the novice hunter killings and the looting of their corpses. As for the protagonist, who was bound to cause more trouble, Yoichi resolved to ensure that a little unfortunate accident would occur in the dungeon. He figured the protagonist had to be just around the corner. The chains continued to guide him, and eventually he reached a corner and peeked around it. What he saw made his eyes widen. The protagonist was sitting atop a pile of monster corpses, fashioned like a throne, exuding an ominous aura. The protagonist addressed him, saying he was awfully late and that he had grown tired of waiting. Yoichi panicked, thinking that his presence should have been completely concealed. He couldn't understand how the protagonist had sensed him. But the protagonist continued, noting aloud that Yoichi must be wondering how he could sense his presence. Yoichi was stunned, thinking that his thoughts had been read. Stepping out from the corner, Yoichi demanded to know what the protagonist was. The protagonist casually remarked that he had heard Owako had chosen Yoichi, but found him to be far less impressive than expected. He added that Yoichi's actions, hunting down novices and extorting money, were cowardly just like Owako. Irritated, Yoichi demanded to know how the protagonist knew that. The protagonist addressed him again, stating that Yoichi seemed to enjoy tormenting others, but had never experienced what it felt like to be haunted. Raising his hand and clenching it into a fist, the protagonist declared that he would now teach Yoichi that very feeling. He concluded that with magic, he would make Yoichi dance his confidence unmistakable. Yoichi called the protagonist a dangerous bastard and claimed he was far too dangerous. His irritated expression lingered as he glared at the protagonist. At that moment, Yoichi drew his sword, which gleamed with a yellow aura. He declared that for the sake of his ambition, he would defeat the protagonist at all costs. He lunged forward, slashing toward him. The protagonist, however, simply leapt backward, dodging the attack while gathering fire magic in his hand. He questioned if that was Yoichi's true strength. Holding the fiery spell toward Yoichi, he prepared to strike. Yoichi effortlessly sliced through the fireball, dissipating it with one swing of his sword. He scoffed at the protagonist's skill level, mocking him for thinking such magic could defeat him. However, he failed to notice another magic attack approaching. At the last second, Yoichi saw the incoming spell and shielded himself with his sword. The magic collided with his blade, forcing him backward with sheer impact. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled as the surrounding stones transformed into spikes. Shocked, Yoichi watched as the spikes surged toward him. Yet with a flurry of sword slashes, he cut them down into bits. He cursed the protagonist's ability to use multi-attribute magic. Demanding answers, Yoichi asked about the protagonist's void. But before he could finish, the protagonist appeared behind him, sword drawn and eyes full of menace. Yoichi barely reacted in time to block the attack. Their blades collided and Yoichi cursed under his breath, accusing the protagonist of interfering with his plans. The clash of swords sent both of them retreating from the force. The protagonist questioned Yoichi's plans, prompting Yoichi to declare his intent to surpass Owako and take his place as a pentagram saint. In response, the protagonist asked why he targeted Owako specifically, noting there were other pentagram saints. With a twisted smirk, Yoichi explained that he chose Owako because he was a dropout. Laughing maniacally, Yoichi said that by becoming a pentagram saint, he would gain the right to rule the book, and targeting the weakest made strategic sense. The protagonist, upon hearing such ambition, sighed in disappointment and called him despicable. Yoichi demanded clarification, and the protagonist revealed he had initially feared Yoichi might reach Iwako first. But now, knowing his pathetic goals, the protagonist admitted there was no reason to worry. Infuriated, Yoichi snapped and charged at the protagonist, hurling insults and slashing wildly with his sword. He screamed about his desires for power, money, and women. The protagonist defended calmly, blocking each blow. Yoichi shouted that he craved power that allowed him to trample others without consequence. Their swords clashed again with intense force. Yoichi exclaimed that as a pentagram saint, he could do whatever he pleased. He declared he would uncover the saintess's weakness and make her his, imagining himself wrapped around her. The protagonist, disgusted, stated that Yoichi's words were no longer worth listening to and that it was time to end things. With a powerful slash, the protagonist sent Yoichi flying, shattering his sword in the process. Sword fragments scattered through the air. Yoichi screamed in disbelief over his broken weapon. Walking toward him, the protagonist remarked that Yoichi's endless rambling had bought him enough time to complete his preparations. As the sword in the protagonist's hand vanished, multicolored lights shimmered behind him. Yoichi, terrified, begged him not to come closer. The protagonist stared at him intently and told him to dance. His pupils glowed purple as he activated absolute hypnosis. The magic enthralled Yoichi, fully immersing him. As the spell completed, Yoichi collapsed. The protagonist observed Yoichi lying on the ground and thought that absolute hypnosis required breaking the target's spirit before activation. He commanded Yoichi to stand. Yoichi's hand twitched and he stood up in a lifeless state, replying, "Yes, sir, I have stood up." The protagonist noted to himself that the spell had worked. He instructed Yoichi to focus on completing the mission and promised further commands later. Yoichi nodded and responded with understanding. Noticing Yoichi's unnatural tone, the protagonist told him to return to his usual manner of speaking. Yoichi's tone normalized as he stated he would resume leading the group and then departed. Satisfied with the result, the protagonist smiled. As he walked through the dungeon, a shadow emerged. Karin appeared, calling out to him and expressing her worry. Smiling, the protagonist apologized, explaining he had been speaking with Yoichi. Karin questioned the topic of their conversation. The protagonist replied that they had discussed how to make her dreams come true. Curious, Karin asked if he had received good advice. He confirmed he had and added that one of his dreams would now certainly come true. Karin smiled warmly, wishing for his dream to come true soon. He responded with agreement. At that moment, Yoichi's voice rang out from behind, announcing the special class's impending victory and instructing all students to gather. Karin urged the protagonist to hurry so they wouldn't fall behind. As they walked, the protagonist reflected that he was glad to have joined the class as he had finally secured a pawn of Iwako's, one Iwako would never suspect. The scene transitioned to Iwako, who was seen speaking with Yoichi and questioning him about the progress regarding the novice hunter incident. Yoichi replied affirmatively and stated that, as expected, a student possessing a unique attribute was involved. He handed a digital tablet to Iwako, who looked at the image of the protagonist displayed on it. Yoichi explained that the student had been held captive at the usual location and was being interrogated. He had admitted to using multi-attribute magic to defeat the novice hunters. Startled by this revelation, Iwako repeated the words multi-attribute magic in disbelief and asked what that meant. With a smirk on his face, Yoichi responded that the specifics were currently unknown but requested more time to uncover the details. Changing the topic, he suggested that it had been a while and proposed Iwako take on the role of the principal again, showing a willing expression. Iwako contemplated the idea and with a twisted expression agreed, saying it wouldn't be a bad idea. Making a disgusted face, he added that it had been some time since he last tortured someone and promised to generously repay Yoichi for the trouble caused by the student. As he cracked his knuckles, Yoichi responded in agreement but was interrupted by the sudden ringing of the telephone. Noticing the ringing, Iwako instructed Yoichi that he would head over later. Yoichi bowed and affirmed he would see Iwako there. After Yoichi left, Iwako picked up the phone and answered with his name. On the other end, a beautiful woman responded flirtatiously, thanking him for choosing them during the previous day's bid. Recognizing the voice, Iwako sternly told her to drop the act. It was revealed that the woman was none other than Ryuoxi, who was shown standing in a room atop a tall building, speaking to Iwako over the phone. She continued the conversation playfully, mentioning their partnership and shared government subsidies. It was revealed that Ryuoxi was a member of the Pentagram Saints and the CEO of the Ryuoxi Company. Iwako commented that she was still the same as ever and said he was busy, requesting to discuss the matter another day. Ryuoxi questioned what business the principal of the academy, known for filling his own pockets, could possibly have. This remark angered Iwako, who warned her to watch her mouth but quickly dropped the matter. He mentioned he was investigating a student with the void attribute. Ryuoxi questioned the usefulness of such a failed attribute. Despite appearances, it was still a unique attribute and thus unpredictable. With a serious tone, he said anything could happen. Ryuoxi's expression turned mischievous as she recalled Koakairo's time attribute magic. Mentioning it caused Iwako's expression to twist with annoyance, and he shouted at her not to speak about Koakairo, claiming it sickened him. Ryuoxi, unbothered, pulled her phone away to muffle his scream and calmly noted he was still as short-tempered as ever. Turning serious, she added that she couldn't blame him, as Koakairo's awakening had drastically shifted the balance of power among adventurers. With a giggle, Ryuoxi ended the call by saying she would contact him again later. Iwako responded with a curt goodbye. After ending the call, he slammed the telephone down in frustration and muttered angrily, calling Ryuoxi a selfish fox. Rising from his chair, he began walking in anger, muttering that hearing that cursed name again had infuriated him. His expression grew dark as he contemplated that it was the perfect time to take out all his anger and torture the student. The scene shifted to a forest, where Iwako's shadow appeared near an abandoned warehouse. As he walked toward it, he wondered how he should torture the student with the void attribute. Unlocking the warehouse door, he thought of various methods, perhaps waterboarding or ripping out nails while wearing a grotesque smile. Laughing to himself, he expressed his intention to unleash all the anger he had suppressed during Koakero's time, now directing it toward this new target. Opening the door with an air of authority, Iwako sarcastically apologized for keeping Yoichi waiting. However, the warehouse was empty, filled only with torture tools. Confused, he questioned why no one was there. At that moment, Yoichi appeared behind him and attacked with a sword. Yet without turning around, Iwako raised his hand and blocked the attack effortlessly. With a menacing tone, he remarked that Yoichi had clearly underestimated him, likely due to the arrogance instilled by Iwako's own praise. It was revealed that Yoichi was still under the effect of the protagonist's absolute hypnosis magic. Enraged, Iwako questioned whether Yoichi seriously believed he could win. Gathering magic in his hand, Iwako conjured golden chains and hurled them at Yoichi, binding him upside down. With Yoichi restrained, Iwako kicked him and declared that someone like him could never be his match. As Yoichi crashed to the ground, Iwako approached him, scolding him for making the wrong choice. Though Yoichi attempted to speak, the chains prevented him. With a menacing tone, Iwako accused Yoichi of ruining himself with foolish desires. At that moment, a voice echoed, mocking Iwako for still being an idiot. Shocked, Iwako turned around and demanded to know who was there. The protagonist revealed himself inside the warehouse, criticizing Iwako for his greed and foolishness. Enraged, Iwako shouted, asserting his authority as principal, but the protagonist calmly replied that the line about foolish desires sounded like a fitting self-introduction for Iwako. Iwako twitched with anger and yelled, demanding the protagonist's student number and vowing to expel him. However, the protagonist smiled, revealing his teeth, and advised Iwako to calm down. With a composed expression, he stated that he had finally arrived at this moment and suggested they take their time and have a private conversation. The protagonist mockingly addressed Iwako, asking if they could have a little chat. In response, Iwako grew furious, gathering magic power in his hand and angrily accusing the protagonist of making a fool of him. The magic power surrounding Iwako's hand began to affect the environment, causing the ground to tremble and erupt. As he clenched his glowing fist, he declared he would show the protagonist the immense gap in their strength. Behind him, a massive hand formed from soil emerged, and Iwako proclaimed it to be an advanced earth attribute magic attack. The giant earthen hand mimicked a fist, and with a scowl, Iwako asserted that there was no way a mere student could evade it. Signaling the attack with his hand, he commanded the spell to strike, shouting, "Die." As he directed his hand toward the protagonist, the massive soul-formed hand surged forward, quickly closing the distance between them. Tremendous impact followed as the giant hand struck the ground where the protagonist had stood, causing an explosion. Iwako began to laugh maniacally, triumphantly declaring that this was the consequence for a mere student who dared to defy him. In the aftermath, smoke filled the air and the ground was devastated along with the abandoned warehouse. Iwako, grinning, asked himself if perhaps he had gone a bit too far. He mused about needing a new place to torture people as he had destroyed the warehouse. Though still unaware of the protagonist's identity, he decided to stick around to witness his death. Iwako pulled out a cloth from his jacket, turned away, and lamented how much of a nuisance the protagonist had been. He wiped the sweat off his face. At that moment, a looming shadow emerged from the ruins of the warehouse. Startled, Iwako looked on as the shadow walked toward him. It was the protagonist, completely unscathed, calmly repeating his earlier invitation for a chat. Seeing that the protagonist was unharmed, Iwako was shocked. He questioned how the protagonist could remain unscathed after being struck by his advanced magic, claiming no student had ever survived such a thing. Demanding answers, he furiously asked the protagonist to reveal his name. The protagonist chuckled and asked if that was truly Iwako's question. Then, with a menacing expression, he asked whether Iwako already knew him. Confused, Iwako exclaimed that he didn't recognize him and ordered him to stop playing games and state his name. In response, the protagonist feigned hurt, asking if Iwako had truly forgotten him. He gave Iwako the same expression he once did in a past life. This triggered a reaction in Iwako, who began backing away in horror. Grabbing his head, he denied the possibility, insisting that the person he feared was definitely dead. Fear overtook Iwako's expression. Addressing the protagonist with a curse, he continued bitterly. He claimed the protagonist must have seen the news report on TV that stated Misato Kawakiro was dead. While saying this, Iwako raised his hand and began channeling green wind magic. Stones swirled around within the vortex of wind, and Iwako shouted that Misato Kawakiro was already dead. Unmoved, the protagonist closed his eyes, sighed, and began walking toward Iwako. He calmly accused Iwako of always believing only what was convenient while ignoring the rest. Still unaffected, Iwako warned the protagonist to stop talking and threatened to strike if he came any closer. The protagonist smirked and acknowledged the situation. He then began to gather magic power in his own hand and accused Iwako of being swayed by sweet lies. With a deadly and intense expression, he added that this was why Iwako had betrayed him, Misato Kaiwakairo. At the mention of the name, Iwako lost control and hurled the green wind magic at the protagonist, screaming for him to shut up. The protagonist remained unshaken and channeled his own magic to counter the attack. In one powerful motion, he sliced Iwako's magical assault in half with his bare hand, causing the energy to vanish. Iwako, in disbelief and despair, recognized the magic. It was the same as the one Kaiwakairo had used in the past. Images of Kaiwakairo flooded Iwako's mind. A powerful blast erupted to the side as the protagonist slashed through the magic. Iwako collapsed to his knees, muttering in denial. With a face full of despair, he insisted that Kaiwakairo had been sealed away. Meanwhile, the protagonist approached him, looming above the kneeling Iwako, and coldly stated that he had been trapped and thrown into the depths of despair. Iwako, still rambling, asked in disbelief if the protagonist was really Misato Kaiwakairo. The protagonist knelt to Iwako's level and, with a smile, said it had taken him long enough to realize. He then greeted Iwako, saying it had been a while and that he was glad Iwako remembered him. With despair evident on his face, Iwako questioned the protagonist, asking if he was Misato Kaiwakairo. In the very next moment, Iwako stood up and, shouting at the protagonist, warned him not to take him for a fool. That would imply that Misato Kaiwakairo had died and returned to the world, his hand now swirling with green magic power. Iwako looked directly at the protagonist and remarked that ghosts should stay quiet. He then hurled a magic attack intended to kill, but the protagonist simply stepped back, effortlessly dodging all the incoming magic. Just then, the protagonist noticed something above him, a massive magic hand composed of soil descending with force to crush him, and it smashed down toward the ground. Yet again, the protagonist evaded the attack. Irritated, Iwako called the protagonist an insolent brat, though inwardly he acknowledged the need to gain the upper hand. He continued to reflect, admitting he might have been a non-combatant during his time as a Golden Seeker. Even now, the other Pentagram Saints mocked him for that, but clenching his fist, he reminded himself that it didn't mean he was weak. Green magic began swirling around him, the ground cracked beneath his feet, and stones began to levitate. He announced that this was the secret technique he had spent 20 years creating. As the levitating stones shone with a yellowish light, a green wind magic, a wind attribute attack, helped suspend them in midair. Iwako declared his attack as a dual magic combining wind and earth attributes. He yelled at the protagonist to take the full force of his technique and launched the combined magic with great power. The stones, powered by wind magic, acted like missiles, striking the ground with explosive impacts one after another. The force of the explosions was massive, and after the final blast, Iwako stood exhausted. As the magic around him dissipated, he asked how the protagonist liked that, claiming it to be his strongest magic. Iwako looked at the area of his attack where smoke lingered and assumed the protagonist wasn't retaliating. He chuckled, then spread his arms and started laughing triumphantly, proclaiming that he had finally defeated Misato Kaiwakairo. Clenching his fist, he praised himself and scoffed at the idea that Kaiwakairo thought he remained the same even after all those years. He dismissed Kaiwakairo's time attribute as a relic of the past, questioning how many years had passed. 20, he recalled. Iwako reaffirmed that he had changed, no longer the man Kaiwakairo once knew. He stated Kaiwakairo should never have underestimated him. Laughing proudly, he continued to boast that 20 years had made him stronger, his level had risen, and it was only natural. He declared that he had finally taken Kaiwakairo down and that he would no longer let the others act high and mighty. Referring to the Pentagram Saints, Iwako, with a devilish expression, proclaimed himself the true strongest among them. Just then, a voice echoed, asking if he was done. The sound of that voice left Iwako utterly terrified. The protagonist stood there, completely unharmed, calmly dusting off his academy uniform. Iwako questioned in disbelief how the protagonist remained unscathed after all those attacks. The protagonist responded, acknowledging Iwako's ability to use powerful magic and even complimenting him as a hero of this era. Yet, with a fake smile and aura surrounding him, he announced that now he could release his anger without holding back. Magic began gathering in the protagonist's hand as he formed a fist. Witnessing this, Iwako's expression turned pale, internally admitting that this man was a monster. But he also told himself that retreat wasn't an option, not after everything he had endured to reach this point. He declared that he wouldn't allow the protagonist to mess with him again. Iwako raised his hand and conjured another giant hand of soil using his earth attribute magic, trying to grab the protagonist. The hand successfully enveloped him, and Iwako smiled, thinking he had caught him. However, the protagonist calmly coughed and sarcastically commented, "My." It became clear that the protagonist had surrounded himself with water magic, preventing the soil hand from restraining him. He mocked Iwako for barking so loudly. Due to the water magic, the soil began to dissolve, and soon the mighty hand disintegrated completely. The protagonist asked if Iwako truly believed that was enough to defeat him. Sweat appeared on Iwako's face as he frantically slashed his wind attribute magic toward the protagonist, shouting at him to stay away. But with a single sweep of his hand, the protagonist created a full-fledged wind hurricane that countered Iwako's attack. The storm was so intense that Iwako shielded himself, but he still ended up being hurled into a tree by the force of the wind. The protagonist, now charging fire magic, looked down on Iwako. Humbled, Iwako knelt before him, begging for forgiveness. He pleaded, apologizing for what had happened 20 years ago. He bowed deeply, hoping for mercy. The protagonist, however, simply stared with a blank expression. Iwako thought to himself that Koichiro had always been a foolishly kind man, and if he begged like this, surely he'd be forgiven. Yet the protagonist's voice echoed coldly, commanding him to shut up. Confusion spread across Iwako's face. The protagonist continued, recalling how Iwako had trapped him back then by exploiting his kindness. With a menacing expression, he asked if Iwako really believed he'd let that happen again. On his knees, Iwako pleaded, reminding the protagonist that they used to be friends. The protagonist, unblinking and radiating menace, replied that Iwako had no right to speak those words, not after turning him into a demon of revenge. With his fist fully charged with fire magic, the protagonist slammed it into Iwako's face and continued to unleash a barrage of punches imbued with various magical attributes. Blood spilled from Iwako's mouth as he looked up and realized too late that he never should have messed with him. One particularly powerful punch caused a massive explosion, launching Iwako into a tree where he slammed his head. The protagonist calmly approached the now unconscious Iwako and remarked that he should be thankful for being spared. He stated he still had questions to ask, but observed that Iwako, now covered in ice crystals, couldn't hear him anymore, knocked out cold. After a few moments, Iwako regained consciousness, appearing dizzy. The protagonist questioned him, standing tall in front of him and saying that he was finally awake. Iwako looked at him in terror, scrambling backward in fear. He began pleading not to be killed, his expression frozen in terror. The protagonist sighed and responded that he wouldn't kill him. However, looming over Iwako with a menacing expression and threatening voice, the protagonist asserted that Iwako would answer his questions. Iwako looked up at the protagonist, utterly terrified. The protagonist rummaged through his uniform and pulled out a phone, stating that the first thing he wanted to know was about a woman. He showed Iwako a contact list on the phone where the woman referred to was named Ryuoxi. Iwako twitched and exclaimed that it was his phone, reaching out to take it back. The protagonist easily pulled the phone away from his grasp and remarked that, according to the call history, Ryuoxi had contacted Iwako that day. He asked menacingly what they had discussed. Iwako, hesitant and nervous, looked down before finally answering that Ryuoxi was coming to Japan in 3 days and he thought she might want to talk about that. Before he could finish, the protagonist smirked and remarked that in 3 days Ryuoxi would. But then he stopped, understanding the purpose behind her visit without revealing it. He then informed Iwako that he had decided what to do next. The protagonist threw the phone back at Iwako, telling him to treat Ryuoxi normally for the time being. Then, placing a finger to his lips in a silencing gesture, he warned Iwako not to reveal anything about his identity. Pointing at Iwako, the protagonist added that while he was unconscious, a spell had been placed on his heart. Hearing that, Iwako was petrified. The protagonist continued, stating that if Iwako revealed his identity to Ryuoxi, his heart would explode. As he demonstrated the gathering of magical fire in his hand and then clenched it into a burst with a loud sound, the threat became very real to Iwako. Realizing the deadly implication, Iwako looked horrified. Walking away, the protagonist reminded him to keep his promise. He then smirked in the shadows, thinking to himself that he hadn't actually used such a spell, but knowing Iwako's personality, the bluff would suffice. Iwako was now clenching his head with his hands, terrified of the protagonist. The protagonist continued thinking while Iwako was on his knees, bowing his head to the ground. He thought that he wouldn't use absolute hypnosis on Iwako, as he wanted Iwako to experience despair while retaining full consciousness of his actions. With an ominous air, the protagonist turned away. 3 days later, on an airplane, an air hostess was serving drinks and snacks to the passengers. Ryuoxi was seated by the window, gazing outside. A man with a slick jacket and long hair called out to her, informing her they were almost there. Just then, the air hostess announced that the plane would soon arrive, but she was interrupted by a loud scream that echoed through the airplane, startling Ryuoxi and the man beside her. The air hostess had been taken hostage by a man pointing a gun at her, while another man threatened the passengers with a gun, announcing a hijacking. The terrorists ordered everyone to the floor and the passengers complied. In that moment, Ryuoxi rose from her seat. The man with the slick jacket looked at her as she started approaching the terrorist with guns in both hands. One of the terrorists warned that non-compliance would be punished, but before he could finish, Ryuoxi appeared in front of him in an instant. With incredible speed, she disarmed him before he could react. The terrorist was too stunned to understand what was happening before she punched him in the stomach. Moving swiftly to the second terrorist, she delivered a palm strike to his face. The passengers were left in awe as both terrorists were swiftly defeated and left unconscious on the ground. The crowd exclaimed that she was Ryuoxi of the Pentagram Saints and celebrated being saved. Ryuoxi tossed the terrorist's gun to the ground. The airplane landed safely and the terrorists were arrested. Observing the aftermath were Ryuoxi, the man with the slick jacket, and another middle-aged man wearing glasses. The man with glasses bowed to Ryuoxi, expressing his gratitude. Smiling, Ryuoxi responded that she was glad she boarded the same plane, noting that the airline's reputation was saved as well. Shifting the conversation, Ryuoxi pointed out that the gun used was a special kind that wasn't detected by security. The man with the slick jacket held the weapon as Ryuoxi stated that many groups had recently acquired gear from dungeons, making it necessary to equip staff with defensive tools. The man with glasses nodded in agreement and promised to make the arrangements. Looming over him, Ryuoxi commented that the gear should be like the one he carried. The man bowed again, assuring her that he would take care of it. Ryuoxi and the man with the slick jacket then walked away. At the airport terminal, Ryuoxi made a phone call, stating that it was her and instructing that the hijackers be released. When questioned by the man beside her whether everything went well, Ryuoxi replied with a calm smile that it was quite entertaining. She added that planting those hijackers had helped seal the deal. Looking mockingly at the cheering crowd, Ryuoxi remarked that it had also served as great publicity. The people gathered at the airport cheered for her, calling her a hero. Ryuoxi waved at them with a fake smile. The scene shifted to Iwako Academy, where several cars were seen parked. From one of the vehicles, a man wearing a slick jacket opened the door and Ryuoxi emerged. As she stepped out, she stated that it was time to take care of the business she had come to Japan for. The scene then transitioned to the principal's office, where Iwako stood looking out the window. His face bore several bandages, a result of having been beaten up by the protagonist. As he noticed an intrusion in his office, he turned around and saw the man with the slick jacket and Ryuoxi entering. Entering the office with a fake smile, Ryuoxi apologized for the intrusion. After a few moments, they were seated on the sofas and Ryuoxi addressed Iwako. She reminded him that he had mentioned looking into a student with the void attribute and asked whether there had been any progress on that matter. Smiling, Iwako responded that it had turned out to be a false alarm. He added that just as Ryuoxi had said, the student was nothing but a worthless failure. Despite his composed words, he was seen sweating slightly. While sipping tea from a cup, Ryuoxi commented that even if it was a unique attribute, it was still nothing special. Internally, Iwako appeared terrified. He thought to himself that if he blurted out something he shouldn't, the magic spell would activate. He reminded himself to respond normally or he would end up dead. Ryuoxi then placed the teacup down on the table and said it was time to get to what she had actually wanted to discuss. With a fierce expression and sharp eyes, she brought up the new drug they were developing and proposed choosing their next guinea pig. After delivering this chilling suggestion, she casually looked away, crossed one leg over the other, and remarked that he had made pretty good use of the academy system, instructing him to first get the list of students. Unbeknownst to them, in another corner, the protagonist had been listening to the entire conversation between Ryuoxi and Iwako. With a menacing expression, he quietly muttered how despicable they were. Then, with determination, he declared that the next one to experience despair would be Ryuoxi, having just overheard something truly vile. The scene shifted, and the protagonist was seen watching TV. The broadcast announced the arrival of the day's news, highlighting that Ryuoxi of the Pentagram Saints had arrived in Japan the previous day. She was being widely praised for handling a hijacking incident and protecting the passengers. As footage of Ryuoxi surrounded by bodyguards played on screen, the protagonist stared at it, recognizing her as one of the people who had betrayed him 20 years ago. He recalled that Ryuoxi produced unique weapons using materials from dungeons and had seemingly made a fortune by selling them. From his earlier conversation with Iwako, he had learned that she might be using the academy for nefarious activities. As he stood up and gazed out of his window, he donned his academy jacket with a smirk, thinking to himself that while Ryuoxi appeared to be a hero on the surface, she exploited others behind the scenes. Determined, he walked out of his room. The scene transitioned to a corridor in Iwako Academy, where the protagonist was seen checking his phone, contemplating how to deal with Ryuoxi. He pondered over the tight security that had been in place when he first arrived at the academy to investigate the situation. Before he could think further, Asahi called out his name and he turned to see her. Recognizing her, he greeted Asahi, who smiled warmly and wished him a good morning. As they walked together, Asahi remarked that he had been reading about Ryuoxi. He admitted it with a cheerful tone. Asahi expressed admiration for Ryuoxi, mentioning how she had fought off hijackers and that her clan, the Great Snake of Changshan, was gaining popularity. When the protagonist asked about Changshan, Asahi explained that it was the clan Ryuoxi had founded, consisting of powerful members. The protagonist considered this information with interest, wondering if the men in black suits guarding Ryuoxi were from that clan. Their conversation continued as Asahi noted that many students at the academy aimed to join the military. She then asked about his plans. The protagonist laughed, about to respond, but an idea struck him. He realized that he might be able to use the clan to get closer to Ryuoxi. With newfound determination, he thanked Asahi, who looked back at him. He added that her comments had helped him realize what he needed to do. As he hurried toward his class, Asahi watched him leave with a puzzled expression before responding softly, "You are welcome." The scene changed to the principal's office, where a cabinet of trophies stood. Iwako, resembling a rabbit, was startled as the telephone rang. He picked it up and identified himself. The protagonist was on the other end, asking for a favor. When Iwako inquired what it was, the protagonist mentioned that if Ryuoxi contacted him, but the details of the conversation were not revealed. Next, the scene shifted to a laboratory filled with people in masks and lab suits. A man was tied up in the center, while two others nearby took notes on his behavior. Just then, Ryuoxi entered the lab, her hand on her waist, asking how he was feeling. A bodyguard stood behind her as she questioned the restrained man. The tied-up man begged her to stop injecting him with the medicine, fearing for his life. Ryuoxi, unfazed, raised her heel over his face. Though horrified, the man glimpsed under her undies and he saw some bushes. Bro is horrified, but Bro got to see her undies, lucky fella. She then crushed him to the ground with her foot, dismissing his plea by saying she didn't heed the opinions of lab rats and for peeking too deep. With a trembling smile, the man listened as Ryuoxi tried to reassure him that if he were compatible with the medicine, he would become stronger. Still trembling, he showed clear fear. Ryuoxi then ordered the lab operators to proceed. As she snapped her fingers, the lab workers approached with a syringe filled with a red liquid. Despite the man's last plea, the injection was administered. He writhed in pain, trembling violently, and eventually lost consciousness. Saliva gushed from his mouth like a Niagara fall. Observing this, Ryuoxi sighed, noting that the subject had lost his language abilities. She remarked that success required some magical skill and that they still needed more data. She turned to leave the lab with her bodyguard, who mentioned the need for more test subjects. Ryuoxi agreed and picked up her phone, stating that they would continue to present their recruitment as being for the Great Snake of Changshan, while secretly using it to gather test subjects. As she entered the elevator, she contacted Iwako and discussed needing students skilled in magic. Fellas, I noticed there are too many shots of foots and legs. Does author has a foot fetish or something anyways? She asked him to select some from his academy. Listening grimly, Iwako proposed holding a selection at the academy to identify capable candidates. Ryuoxi, impressed, acknowledged the idea and complimented him. When the elevator reached the ground floor, Ryuoxi exited while continuing the call. She said the specifics such as date and time would follow. After the call ended, Iwako placed the receiver down and stood, reflecting that he had done as requested. He then called out to the protagonist. The scene then moved to a conference hall where Iwako Academy students were assembled. Ryuoxi's bodyguard addressed them, announcing that the Great Snake of Changshan would hold a selection exam for new recruits. Murmurs spread among the students, some in disbelief, others excited for the opportunity. Amid the crowd, the protagonist watched with a smirk, thinking to himself that this was his chance to get close to Ryuoxi. His smile grew wider. The scene shifted to an arena where the students of Iwako Academy were all lined up. In front of them stood the members of the Great Snake of Changshan. A representative of the Great Snake of Changshan addressed the assembled students, thanking them for coming to the selection exam. Ryuoxi's bodyguard, holding a paper in his hand, began explaining the exam's process. As he did so, the protagonist was lost in thought, reminding himself that in order to join the Great Snake of Changshan and get close to Ryuoxi, he had to pass the selection exam. He recalled how previously he tried not to draw attention to himself when approaching Iwako, but this time things were different. He wanted to catch the eye of Yang, Ryuoxi's right-hand man. As the name of Ryuoxi's bodyguard and the examiners were revealed, the protagonist made up his mind to show off his powers this time. The scene then showed the protagonist leaning against a wall, hands in his pockets, resting. He was soon approached by Asahi, who hurried over and asked if he was taking the exam. He nodded and returned the question, to which she responded affirmatively. Inwardly, the protagonist admitted he hadn't wanted her to get involved, but it was inevitable. Asahi, forcing a smile, confessed that while she knew she didn't truly belong there, she had her reasons for wanting to join. The protagonist looked at her with a questioning gaze as she encouraged them both to do their best and make it through together. He replied with a simple yeah, while inwardly vowing that he had to succeed no matter what. The scene returned to the arena, where the examiner announced the beginning of the test to measure magical power. He pointed to a golden orb in front of the students which looked like the FIFA World Cup, explaining that it was a device that visualized the magical power of anyone who touched it. He asked the students to step forward one by one. One student approached and touched the orb, causing it to emit waves. The examiner recorded the student's magical power grade, sighing before calling the next participant. The next student was the protagonist. Smiling, he approached the examiner and politely stated he would be in their care. The examiner checked his academy ID card and upon noting the void attribute and that the student was level 30, looked disappointed. The protagonist sensed the examiner's low expectations. As he reached out and touched the orb, a voice echoed, "Ronaldo or Messi?" But our boy chose Benzema because he is into 15-year-olds. Regardless, a brilliant golden light infused with all sorts of colors erupted throughout the arena. The light was so intense that the students and the examiner had to shield their eyes. Everyone was stunned. Students exclaimed in disbelief. Asahi too was momentarily blinded by the light. A force accompanied the light, pushing back both students and the examiner. After the display, the protagonist removed his hand from the orb and turned to the examiner, asking if that was sufficient. The examiner, startled and sweating slightly, affirmed and wrote down the protagonist's magical power grade as S. The next phase, the magic skills test, began. The protagonist demonstrated his earth attribute by creating a lump of rock while his magical energy radiated around him. The examiner questioned if that was all he could do, mentally noting that having a high magical power alone wasn't enough. Smiling knowingly, the protagonist, aware of the examiner's thoughts, conjured a water ball in his other hand, followed by a fireball, a wind ball, and a thunder-lightning attribute ball. He displayed all the basic elemental attributes. Bro started farming aura here. The members of the Great Snake of Changshan were shocked by the aura farming. One of them remarked on his ability to use all the basic attributes. The protagonist thought to himself, asking how people felt seeing a void attribute user, often mocked as powerless, perform such feats. After the awe-inspiring display, Asahi approached and praised the protagonist, saying it was amazing. He thanked her and encouraged her to do her best too. Asahi pouted and nodded in agreement. Soon after, she stood before a set of dead-looking plants while another female examiner observed her. Asahi summoned her magic in both hands, golden light radiating as the plants in front of her began to grow, glowing with the same golden hue. Within moments, the plants had bloomed into fully grown flowers. Despite this, the surrounding students mocked her power, questioning its usefulness. The protagonist, however, watched in awe, recognizing her magic as light attribute, something very rare. He acknowledged that it must be difficult for examiners to properly evaluate her abilities and felt a pang of sympathy, thinking it would be better if she didn't get dragged into his own complex situation. After her demonstration, Asahi, disheartened, walked away with a sad expression. Meanwhile, Yang, Ryuoxi's bodyguard, observed her silently. He then noted her name in his phone, labeling her as worth trying as a test subject. The scene shifted, revealing the next round of the examination. All the academy students were lined up, while the members of the Great Snake of Changshan stood in front of them. Yang then announced that they would now conduct one-on-one duels. He proceeded to introduce several individuals, pointing to a group standing behind him, and stated that these people would be their opponents. One of the academy students questioned whether they were really expected to fight members of the Great Snake of Changshan. Yang, replying nonchalantly, assured them that the evaluation wouldn't be solely based on winning or losing. What mattered, he said with a mischievous expression, was how they fought. Confidently, he added that there was no way a student could actually win against one of them in the first place. The scene transitioned to a muscular man stretching his arms in preparation for battle. His opponent was revealed to be the protagonist. As he stretched, the muscular man mocked him, asking if he was the student who had caused a stir during the exam. He commented that although the protagonist had shown off and achieved good results in earlier tests, it would mean nothing in real combat. His smug expression lingered as he boasted. The protagonist simply smiled and responded politely that he hoped to learn a lot from him today. Grinning, the muscular man declared that he would finish the fight with one hand. Gathering a lump of rocks in his hand using magical powers, he thrust them towards the protagonist. The rocks hurtled forward at high speed, but the protagonist, calm and still, used his wind attribute magic to swirl and repel them. The rocks were deflected back, striking the muscular man all over his body. He shielded himself using his large arms but looked shocked, exclaiming in disbelief that his magic had been destroyed in a single hit. In the very next moment, the protagonist vanished from sight. The muscular man realized with alarm that he was gone. Suddenly, the protagonist reappeared behind him, holding an ice blade in his hand. As the muscular man trembled, the protagonist mockingly questioned whether creating an opening by casting magic was what he considered real combat. Annoyed, the muscular man admitted that he had learned a lot today. The examiner then declared the winner. It was the protagonist. Yang, who was Ryuoxi's bodyguard and among the crowd of students, thought to himself about the protagonist's unexpected victory against a member of the Great Snake of Changshan. He wondered who this student could possibly be, his expression now one of annoyance and irritation. His confidence in the Great Snake of Changshan had been shaken. The scene then shifted to Ryuoxi, who was relaxing inside a building, looking out through a large window while speaking on the phone. From the other end, she was informed that the exam had concluded. Looking at some papers in her hand, Ryuoxi asked if any interesting subjects had been found. Yang, on the other side of the call, mentioned that there was indeed a student of interest. Ryuoxi repeated, slightly intrigued, "A student of interest," Yang confirmed, explaining that the student had passed the exam with overwhelmingly strong performance and added that the student seemed to possess the void attribute. Hearing this, Ryuoxi recalled a conversation she had with Iwako and wondered if this could be the same student he had been investigating. Rising from her previously relaxed posture, she stood up with a menacing expression and told the caller that it seemed she had just found a very interesting guinea pig. The scene shifted once again to the conference hall, where Yang, Ryuoxi's bodyguard, stood before the students who were lined up. He announced that he would now reveal the names of those who had passed the selection exam. The first name he called was that of the protagonist. At that moment, a murmur ran through the group of students. They commented among themselves, remarking that, of course, the protagonist had made it and that the exam was ridiculous. Meanwhile, the protagonist smiled subtly and thought to himself that everything had gone exactly as planned. He believed that now he would be able to get close to Ryuoxi. Yang then announced the second name, revealing that Asahi had also passed. Asahi, upon hearing her name, looked shocked and slightly worried. However, she quickly realized that she had indeed been selected and felt happy about it. The protagonist, watching Asahi, questioned internally how she had been chosen. He thought that simply having a unique attribute like light shouldn't have been enough. He suspected that Ryuoxi might be using academy students as part of a conspiracy and wondered if there was a deeper reason behind Asahi's selection. As he continued observing her, Asahi noticed his gaze and responded with a cute smile. The protagonist returned the smile and silently resolved that he wouldn't let anyone harm her. However, his expression soon turned menacing as he vowed to achieve his goal while protecting her. A few days passed after the selection examination, and the scene moved to a towering building, the Japanese branch of Ryuoxi's company. The selected students had gathered inside, and Yang welcomed them all. He informed them that a suitability check would be conducted before onboarding them to the Great Snake of Changshan, and that Ryuoxi would also be coming. Hearing this, the protagonist's expression grew serious. Yang turned his head and directed the students into the large building, saying that Ryuoxi would meet them after the suitability check. He then offered to show them around. The students, including the protagonist and Asahi, began walking through the massive structure. The protagonist considered going to Ryuoxi immediately, but realized he couldn't leave Asahi alone at the moment. Asahi, gazing at the impressive building, commented that being in such a grand place made her nervous. The protagonist agreed. With a cheerful expression, Asahi said that joining the Great Snake of Changshan made her very happy. The protagonist remained silent for a moment and then asked her why she wanted to join. Asahi awkwardly explained that her mother was in the hospital and the medical expenses were high. The protagonist then understood that Asahi's motivation stemmed from her concern for her mother, not for him. He resolved even more firmly to protect her. At that moment, Yang guided the group to an underground basement, announcing their arrival. The students entered the basement and found themselves in a facility filled with digital screens and people in black suits. The protagonist speculated that this was a testing facility and considered the identity of the people present. Suddenly, Yang, wearing a fierce expression, ordered his men to close the doors. The heavy doors shut, startling the students. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the protagonist thought to himself that there was no intention of letting anyone escape. He acknowledged how serious things had become. Two students approached Yang, demanding an explanation. With a menacing tone, Yang told them to be quiet, sending shivers down their spines. He then explained that they would now conduct the suitability check, specifically for a new drug being secretly developed. He retrieved a vial of red liquid from one of his men, the same substance previously injected into a tied-up man. Yang elaborated that the drug, created from ingredients gathered in dungeons, had the potential to greatly enhance physical and magical abilities. Hearing this, the two students seemed briefly encouraged. However, the protagonist asked whether the drug had any side effects. In response, Yang pointed to a digital screen, stating it would be quicker to show the results. On the screen, the same tied-up man from earlier was shown, pleading tearfully to live. The students watched in horror, especially Asahi, as the man continued to suffer visibly. The two students exclaimed in shock, asking what they had just witnessed. Yang calmly replied that the man was incompatible with the drug and that what they saw was the consequence. The students became furious, shouting that they would never take something so dangerous. One used fire magic while the other used water magic, both preparing to attack Yang and demanding to be let out. Yang remained unfazed. The protagonist warned Asahi to stay by his side, prompting her to look at him questioningly. Meanwhile, Yang clenched his glowing fist and swiftly struck both attacking students in the stomach, causing them to collapse in pain. He coldly remarked that the number of test samples had decreased, reducing them to mere objects. Yang's gaze then shifted to Asahi and he pointed at her, suggesting that they begin with her. Asahi was visibly terrified. Yang began drawing the red liquid into a syringe, eager to see the result of injecting it into someone with the light attribute. As he approached Asahi step by step, she became increasingly scared. But just in time, the protagonist stepped between her and Yang, shielding her. Yang questioned what he was doing. The protagonist, with defiance, told him to stay away from her, calling him a sucker. Yang twitched in anger and ordered his men to restrain the protagonist. Several black-suited individuals appeared, including a large, muscular man who cracked his knuckles menacingly. He moved to attack, but the protagonist evaded with lightning speed, leaving the man stunned. As the man turned to locate him, the protagonist delivered a swift chop to his neck, taking him down instantly. The remaining goons, terrified, watched as the protagonist eliminated them one by one with incredible speed and a fierce expression. Soon, all of Yang's men were defeated. Yang stood in disbelief, muttering that it was impossible for all his men to be taken down with just one hit each. The protagonist looked back at Yang with a menacing glare and declared that he was next. Panicked, Yang began retreating and turned his focus back to Asahi, thinking that capturing her would secure his win. He lunged at her as she screamed in fear, but the protagonist appeared instantly, grabbing Yang's hand before it could reach her. He reminded Yang that he had warned him not to come near her. Seeing this, Yang was terrified by the protagonist's speed and yanked his hand away, gritting his teeth and wondering how a regular student could possess such power. The protagonist, now truly enraged at Yang's attempt to harm Asahi, activated a power that caused his pupils to glow purple. With cold fury, he issued a final warning: brace yourself. Yang backed away after receiving a fierce glare from the protagonist. Yang cursed under his breath, and the protagonist instructed Asahi to stay behind him. He shielded Asahi from Yang, prompting her to thank him. Inwardly, Asahi admired the protagonist, thinking he was amazing. She couldn't even comprehend the moves he had used earlier and acknowledged his growth in strength, though she hadn't expected it to be this extensive. At that moment, Yang yelled at the protagonist not to get too cocky. The protagonist responded by loudly asking one question first. The students of the academy were being used as guinea pigs in their experiments, weren't they? He demanded to know why. Yang laughed and scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He claimed the reason was simple. Those who followed Miss Ryuoxi could receive her blessings. Once their drug was completed, she would gain even greater strength. The protagonist asked if Yang truly believed such inhuman experiments were acceptable just for that purpose. Yang replied that they were simply using what was available and added with a smirk that it was an honor for the students to serve as their guinea pigs. Hearing those words, both the protagonist and Asahi were visibly shocked. The protagonist recalled Asahi's earlier words about her mother being in the hospital and how joining the Great Snake of Changshan made her happy. The protagonist clenched his fist and his face darkened. Yang then pointed at Asahi, saying she should be thrilled to be a guinea pig. In response, the protagonist shouted at Yang to shut up, and a blue aura formed around him. The power emanating from the protagonist repelled Yang, who shielded himself in surprise. The protagonist, furious, questioned who Yang thought he was and called him trash who trampled on others without understanding how Asahi felt. Asahi called out to the protagonist, realizing he was standing up for her. She had wanted to join the organization, but now understood they were just using the students as test subjects. Yang, feeling the incredible pressure, wondered to himself if the protagonist was truly just a student. He began to sweat and then offered the protagonist a deal. He said he normally would tell him to know his place but admired his courage. Yang suggested that if the protagonist handed over Asahi, Miss Ryuoxi might even make him an executive. The protagonist, already furious, grew even angrier. He warned Yang again to shut up, declaring he couldn't forgive people like him. Yang loosened his tie and threatened that the protagonist would regret this. Suddenly, a yellow energy engulfed Yang as his eyes glowed yellow and his body grew heavy, stomping the ground beneath him. The protagonist recognized the magic and questioned whether it was body-strengthening magic. Yang confirmed it was, saying it was his unbeaten skill, a combination of martial arts and magic. With fury in his eyes, he invited the protagonist to come at him. Without waiting, Yang lunged forward, shattering the ground, and attempted to punch the protagonist midair, yelling at him to take the hit. The protagonist dodged the attack just as it shattered the ground, leaving Asahi shocked by Yang's power. Yang, full of arrogance, commented that the protagonist managed to dodge it. The protagonist confirmed it was body-strengthening magic and acknowledged its power. Yang dashed toward him again, telling him not to run. The protagonist tapped into his consciousness, concentrating and visualizing the magic he had seen. While the protagonist was deep in concentration, Yang closed the distance and taunted him, asking if he had given up. As Yang's punch neared, he shouted for the protagonist to die. But just then, the protagonist activated his void magic and blocked the punch before it could land. Yang was shocked, exclaiming it was impossible. The protagonist possessed the same power, only stronger. Body-strengthening magic now surrounded the protagonist. Smirking, he thanked Yang for helping him learn to imagine the spell. Going full Super Saiyan, the protagonist stomped the ground, twisted his body, and delivered a powerful punch, sending Yang flying. Yang spat saliva and crashed into the laboratory wall. As he slipped into unconsciousness, his face was just like when I hold my piss for a long time. Anyways, he questioned who the protagonist really was. The protagonist stood tall before Yang, now collapsed on the ground, looking down at his pathetic state. Moments later, Asahi thanked the protagonist. He asked if she was all right and checked her condition. He then instructed the other two students to escape while he cleared a path for them. When the students asked where he would go, the protagonist didn't respond. Instead, he shattered the wall, creating a large hole and walked through it. He finally told the students he had something he needed to do. The scene shifted to Ryuoxi, who received a phone call. On the other end, the caller urgently informed her that Mr. Yang had been defeated and the students had escaped. Confused, Ryuoxi asked for clarification. The caller said an incredibly strong person was approaching, but his voice cracked, implying he had also been defeated. Ryuoxi, shocked, wondered what had just happened. At that moment, someone entered Ryuoxi's office with a casual greeting. Ryuoxi, cautious, asked who he was and why he had come. The protagonist answered calmly. He had come back to settle the score for what had happened 20 years ago. Ryuoxi questioned the protagonist, demanding to know what he meant by a debt from 20 years ago and asking for clarification. As he approached her, he remarked that she seemed confused and asked if he should spell it out. Her confusion was evident, and the protagonist continued, referencing the SSS rank dungeon incident from 2 decades ago. He reminded her how the Pentagram Saints were hailed as heroes. Despite her annoyed reaction, he pressed on, stating that a certain man's conspiracy had been thwarted that day. Ryuoxi dismissed him, mocking the idea that a student like him was trying to give her a history lecture. She too moved closer to him. The protagonist pointed out that the Pentagram Saints were now influential leaders across the world. Ryuoxi picked up where he left off, acknowledging that they were celebrated as heroes who defeated evil, and asked what exactly he was implying. At that moment, the protagonist's expression darkened. He declared that the truth was far from what people believed. Slightly worried, Ryuoxi asked him to repeat himself, all while internally noting that his aura had suddenly shifted. He accused her of sacrificing her comrades to build her legacy and trampling on their will. Even now, was he wrong? Ryuoxi responded with a nonchalant smile, claiming she was wondering what he was talking about and scoffing at the idea that he believed in conspiracy theories. He insisted it wasn't a mere conspiracy, he knew what she did. He looked at her intently and accused her of pushing her comrades into the gate. Her expression shifted into shock, caught off guard by the accusation. She questioned how some random student could know such a thing. She stared at him as he stood in front of her. The protagonist challenged her, asking if she still didn't realize who he truly was. With a piercing gaze, he revealed his identity. He was Misato. The mention of that name left Ryuoxi terrified. She denied it, claiming it was impossible. He countered, asserting that it did happen and that he had used the very power that once made her call him a monster. As Ryuoxi began to lose her composure, she exclaimed in disbelief, struggling to accept that Misato was truly before her. The protagonist declared he also knew what the Ryuoxi company had been secretly doing. Furious, Ryuoxi slammed the wall behind her and warned him not to mess with her. The protagonist responded that if he exposed that secret, her reputation would be ruined. Walking toward her, he continued with conviction. He challenged her previous outburst, saying that she shouldn't be the one saying, "Don't mess with me." Coming close to her, he swore never to forgive her, for what happened 20 years ago and for crushing the hopes of Asahi, who had given everything. Ryuoxi scoffed at his words, stating he shouldn't underestimate her since he was no longer in Misato's body. She grabbed her spear from behind and, seething with anger, declared that he would regret ever showing himself. As magical energy enveloped her spear, she launched an attack, slamming it toward the protagonist. The force of her strike was so powerful that the office began to crack and crumble. The protagonist quickly backed away and dodged the attack. Now poised with her weapon, Ryuoxi asked if he understood what he was facing, the power of a weapon developed by the Ryuoxi company. She announced it was forged from dungeon materials, tougher than any metal. Leaping into the air, she vowed to show him its sharpness and attacked upon landing. Though she attempted to stab him, the protagonist kept dodging every strike. He effortlessly tracked the spear's movement, dodging each attack. Ryuoxi increased her speed, commenting that dodging seemed to be his only skill. Internally, she sensed something was wrong. Why weren't her attacks connecting? While evading, the protagonist mockingly remarked that she'd become too accustomed to playing corporate queen and had gotten sloppy, likening her to a wako. Furious, Ryuoxi's face twisted with rage, and she shouted in frustration, throwing the spear at him with all her might. It seemed to pierce him, and she reacted with glee, thinking she had struck him down, but it was just an afterimage. The real protagonist stood nearby, taunting her with a simple "too bad." Seeing this, Ryuoxi grew angrier. She suspected void magic and admitted she'd never seen it work like that. Gritting her teeth, she readied another move. Retrieving her spear from the ground, flames began to swirl around it in her. She declared that she'd finish him with the next blow and would silence him for good. Charging at him with fiery determination, she aimed to kill. However, something felt off. Just before reaching him, she froze. The protagonist had stopped her effortlessly, holding out two fingers to display his power. Horrified, Ryuoxi trembled and whispered in disbelief. The protagonist coldly remarked that this was the extent of her strength. Internally, Ryuoxi realized he was even stronger than he was 20 years ago. Sweat dripped from her face as she contemplated her next move. With grim resolve, she decided she had no choice but to use that. Letting go of her spear, she sprinted not to him but past him. Confused, the protagonist watched her. He noticed her reaching for a red drug on her desk. Without hesitation, she injected it into her neck. A dark purple aura engulfed her. The protagonist, alarmed, questioned her sanity, asking if she was really going that far. Her transformation was monstrous. Her hair turned white, her skin grew dark and scaled, her hands bore claws, and her eyes became pitch black with glowing purple pupils. The protagonist could only look at her in horror, calling her a monster.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Please support this new content creator, and please leave comments that will motivate me to do more.